Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Jasmine Lee. The ceasefire negotiations between Ukraine, Russia, and the U.S. continue to evolve. On March 18th, President Donald Trump spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The following day, he held a call with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy, hoping to broker a 30-day pause in the attacks on the two countries' energy infrastructure. Then on March 24th, U.S. and Russia's officials met in Saudi Arabia to discuss a Black Sea maritime ceasefire before a wider agreement in Ukraine. How do these developments affect the outlook of the war? Meanwhile, China, which has been a key supporter of Russia's war efforts, has for the first time expressed its intention to assist with Ukraine's reconstruction. How might Ukraine and European countries respond to this move? Join us today are Huang Kwei-bo, National Chengchi University Department of Diplomacy Professor; Peifen Hsieh, International Cooperation and Development Fund Deputy Secretary General. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show. According to Reuters, after a 90-minute call with Trump, Putin rejected a proposal for 30-day ceasefire but agreed to a prisoner exchange with Ukraine and to pause attacks on critical infrastructure. As for Trump's conversation with Zelenskyy, Ukraine reportedly requested additional air defense systems. Trump, in turn, suggested placing Ukraine's nuclear plants under U.S. control to ensure energy security. So, Professor Huang, let's look into the pivotal conversations between U.S. and Russia. So, Putin, he kept Trump waiting for a full hour before he took a call with him on March 18th. What is his intention?
It was very unusual for the two top leaders to meet not on time.
Yes.
So supposedly, both should have kept their schedule so that they could meet on time. So if that was true, then I think Putin would like to show to the rest of the world that, hey, guys, I'm the boss. Okay, so he has to wait.
Yes.
Even though he's very strong, but he still have to wait. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's one possibility. And the second possibility is that Putin would like to play a game of patience during the bilateral negotiations. Why patience? Because we know that Putin has been very experienced in not only domestic, but also international politics.
Yes.
And he's trained by KGB.
Yes.
And well-known communist leaders for decades. So I think he got some good natured patience when negotiating with others when necessary. While Donald Trump isn't very much patient, at least his persona tells us that he's not. So if the game of patience is played, then I think maybe Donald Trump would be very hasty because he couldn't wait. So he was so eager to speak to Vladimir Putin before important decision could be made. So if Donald Trump is losing patience, that is, he would like to make some decisions in a very hasty way. Haste makes mistakes. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's why, another possibility, Putin would like to delay the meeting for an hour so that Donald Trump would be impatient and he might make some mistakes due to haste. Okay, and the third possibility is that, through all this, could Putin create some favorable initiative in further negotiation with the U.S.? Because Donald Trump would like to he like to push the button to make things work. So Putin might be very much patient and willing to slow down the process of negotiation while he could put forward to some initiative in favor of Russia. For example, Putin might propose something that Zelenskyy cannot agree or promise. So that is a bargaining chip for Putin. And we don't know what happened during the negotiation or over the phone call because we cannot 100% trust on whatever released by the governments.
It wasn't live streaming like with Ukraine.
Yeah, so all I can say is that maybe Putin is trying to wait for some moment to create some favorite initiative in the further negotiations.
And as you mentioned about the further negotiation, I also wanted to talk about the Saudi talks. So the White House, they stated that their goal is to secure a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. But my question is, how significant is this step in the broader effort to achieve a comprehensive ceasefire agreement?
You know, Black Sea has been a very troublesome water for the past, say, a decade or two. So if a ceasefire can be achieved in the Black Sea, then maybe it wouldn't be very much problematic for the two sides, I mean, Ukraine and Russia, to attain some further ceasefire, after the success in Black Sea ceasefire. So I think it can be seen as a test for the U.S. government to try to persuade the Ukrainians and Russians to accept this ceasefire work at least for like 30 days. So we don't know whether or not both sides are going to agree. But I think it's very important for us to observe that actually the U.S. has become the only major third-party mediator in Russo-Ukrainian armed conflicts. And Donald Trump doesn't want any others to step in.
Yeah.
So in the foreseeable near future, I think Donald Trump will remain the only guy that would like to exercise political influence in persuading both Russia and Ukraine to go to the negotiating table and reach a ceasefire agreement.
And Peifen, I want to ask you, because Russia, they launched over 40 drones right after Putin had a call with Trump. So, and the drone was targeting hospitals in Ukraine. And Zelenskyy said that Putin has no intention of honoring a ceasefire and is merely stalling for time. So do you agree with this assessment? And how do you think, does this mean that the Trump-Putin calls had very little impact on the war?
Well, actually, I would say the significance of a Trump-Putin call is not necessarily about the impact on the war per se, but about two things. The first is that about a bigger trend of change in the two countries' bilateral relations. So that is now the U.S. is directly and diplomatically engaging with Russia in ending the war. And this didn't happen before. And the second is that it's about the way in which the war or end of the war will be handled from now on. The U.S. will be involved not as an ally of Ukraine or as a partner or supporter of Ukraine, but rather as a mediator and rather an impatient mediator between the two parties. But going back to the impact of the Trump-Putin call per se, I won't say Putin absolutely has no intention of honoring an agreement with Trump because actually that agreement is also partly in the interest of Russia. For example, under the selective ceasefire, Ukraine will no longer be able to attack Russia's energy facilities using drones. Ukraine has been largely using drones in attacking Russian facilities. But however, Putin is absolutely not completely honoring the agreement as well, as we can see. But the way he's doing is like he's introducing technical issues, technical obstacles in the way. For example, the U.S. side seems to believe that the scope of the 30-day ceasefire includes both energy and infrastructure. But according to the Russian side, they say they only agree upon energy infrastructure. It's not energy and infrastructure. They only limited the scope of the agreement on the energy infrastructure. So this becomes a very funny situation where he says and she says. So I don't disagree with Zelenskyy, but I think Putin clearly is selecting which part of the agreement and interpreting the agreement between Putin and Trump in its own benefits.
And how would you assess the future outlook of the war?
Well, no one can say for certain how soon the ceasefire will be achieved or in what ways. But one thing that's certain is that the war is rapidly going into a direction that is to the disadvantage of Ukraine. So as you can see, as we all know, that the U.S. has been the biggest supporter of Ukraine since the outbreak of the war. And that's one of the main reasons why Ukraine is able to resist Russia until now. But as Trump has so clearly showed, such a strong support from the US is no longer available under his administration. So this is why I believe the longer the war persists, the more disadvantaged Ukraine will become.
And Professor Huang, what do you think about the future trajectory of the war?
Yes, I agree that the tendency is that a ceasefire is gradually talked about, and it is possible to reach probably within weeks. But in the same time, still, the main actors involved in this armed conflict, that is Ukraine and Russia, haven't talked face to face.
Yeah.
So you see, as I said just now, the US played the major third-party mediating role in speaking to Russians first, then speaking to Ukrainians later, and then the US act like a messenger, according to some news, in order to push two sides to get closer. Whether or not that would work, actually it's not the attitudes of the mediation, but it's actually the will of the big powers, that is Russia and the US, in the game. That is, more specifically, if the US is determined to push the Ukrainians to the corner, that is, negotiate with the Russians, or everything will be stopped, including the aid programs.
Yeah.
If that's the case, then what could Ukraine do? Speak to Russians. So I think it's now very possible that Putin is calling for no more military and intelligence aid to Ukrainians, while Donald Trump says with confidence that he can control the situation and bring ceasefire to the region very soon. So is there any overlapping area? Ceasefire.
Yeah.
Okay, so if Donald Trump is going to sacrifice some of the interests of Ukraine in exchange of temporary ceasefire between the two countries, he may be able to do it because he would tell Zelenskyy that, trust me, Putin is not going to attack you. He assured that to me, Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case, then, as I said, the US may be going to pressurize Ukrainians in order to get some ceasefire, before Putin makes some important military actions against Ukraine again.
So as we were talking about the role of Trump, Peifen, I want to ask you, what do you think, what benefit could Trump potentially gain from brokering a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, there's a lot of discussion on why Trump is kind of getting involved in the war himself right now. Well, first of all, I think Trump somehow is actually genuine in trying to end the war. Trump sometimes can be very unpredictable, but there's one thing that is pretty consistent so far is that he tries to keep his campaign promises. So during his presidential campaign last year, he actually has repeated several times that the war has to be ended soon under his leadership. So we have to understand this is not just an internationally minded Trump, if there's one, but it's about his promise to his voters and his self-portrayal of him being the most powerful leader in the world. So in his mind, he strongly and wholeheartedly believes that the reason the war broke out was because of Biden's incompetency. We all know his contempt toward Biden. So for him, I think it's like personal reputation is at stake. He needs to show that he's different from Biden. So I believe he really has a will to end the war. Well, despite the way he's trying to do it. And he's not just paying lip service. But on the other hand, because Trump wants to be the peacemaker so badly, Russia actually seeks an opportunity for itself because Russia currently appears determined to squeeze as many benefits from Trump as possible so that just Trump can reach his ceasefire deal. So therefore, by showing his genuinity of broken a ceasefire, actually, I think Trump kind of put himself in a rather vulnerable position vis-a-vis Putin. But whether and how long Trump will be interested in this peacemaking deal remains in the question.
Professor Huang, do you agree with that? And allow me to mention one thing here. According to White House statement, the U.S. hopes to take control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the Ukraine, and which is currently occupied by Russian force. And we know that Trump, he has a very transactional manner when it comes to foreign affairs. So my question is, what is the strategic importance of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and what might President Trump's intentions be in seeking control over it?
This Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It generates a lot of electricity, not only for Ukraine, but for the neighboring countries when they needed it. So economically and in terms of the importance of power supply, these power plants, of course, serve a very strategically important role in regional development. But it's, as you said, under the control of Russians. My hunch that President Donald Trump would like to, take the control over, mainly because, one, some people said if this power plant is going to be active or reactivated, then some of the U.S. nuclear technology under the U.S. export control policy will be known to Russians. So not until U.S. or Ukrainians control the power plant, then I do not think these power plants will begin to function. But why Donald Trump argued for the control over the power plant? I think a second reason is that, that can serve as a bargaining chip for Donald Trump when negotiating with Russia and with Ukraine. So this largest power plant is in my hand. So don't do something stupid, or I might give the ownership or give the operation rights to the other side, which you don't like.
As a third party, he's also need a bargain chip.
Yes, so this is one bargain chip to enhance his role in mediating.
Yes.
And last reason possible is that, of course, Donald Trump would like to keep this nuclear power plant safer. So in the Russians' hand, safer, we don't know. In Ukrainians' hands, safer, vulnerable. In American hands, for now, for the time being, may be safer, unless Russians or Ukrainians are going to attack Americans. So maybe these are possible reasons why Donald Trump would like to keep the control over that power plant.
And let's now talk about another major international power. According to Reuters, China's International Development Corporation Agency spokesperson Li Ming stated that China would offer assistance within its capacity and take part in Ukraine's future reconstruction efforts. So China has been a very important supporter of Russia during this war. So Peifen, I wanted to ask you, what is the intention of China, and how do you think Ukraine and other European countries would respond to this?
Well, rebuilding Ukraine is actually a huge project, and those will generate considerable business opportunities.
Yes.
So in actually 2 years ago, 2023, China has pledged in its Ukraine position paper to assist with Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. So this position is not entirely new. But we have to understand China from the point of view, I think in the context of Belt and Road Initiative, that can be a very good reference. So since even before its official announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been largely investing in its resource extraction and infrastructure development. So both domestically and actually abroad. So they have a vested interest in this sector. And also, as we can see, China is now, the economy is facing serious crisis at this moment. So it's not super surprising that China would wish to take part in this reconstruction work of Ukraine, both for its development of the relevant sector and for the its domestic economy sake. But also apart for the political considerations. But however, on the other side, China has showed the willingness to take part in the reconstruction work. But I wonder if the US, and as you mentioned, other countries would be interested in taking on this proposal, because from the United States side, both the first Trump administration and Biden administration have warned for years about China's hazardous involvement in infrastructure development. So I believe it's unlikely that the US will welcome China's heavy involvement in the reconstruction work of Ukraine. And speaking of business opportunities, I think the Trump administration will be most interested in that as well. So I wonder how much they will allow China to take part in.
And let's now talk about the global order that has been involved during this negotiations between US, Russia, and Ukraine. President Trump has stated that the US and Russia are already discussing dividing assets as part of an effort to end the fighting in Ukraine. Many analysts suggested that the approach bears a striking resemblance to the 1945 Yalta Conference, where Europe was divided into spheres of influence during the early stage of the Cold War. So, Professor Huang, could you help us give us a lesson of a history? It's like, what kind of lesson we learn from the history of the Yalta Conference?
You know, it's very uncommon to see that when the Ukrainian territory is to be safeguarded by a foreign power, but Ukrainians have no say about it.
Yeah.
You know, it's Americans, Russians, who
great powers.
Yeah, the great powers who sit on the negotiating table talking about the possible division of lands or resources, which is pitiful, actually. But that's the cruel reality of international politics. And the Yalta Conference you mentioned was held in February 1945. It was joined by the so-called Big Three.
Yeah.
The US, the UK, and USSR.
Yes.
And the US represented by Franklin Roosevelt, UK by Winston Churchill, and USSR by Joseph Stalin. Actually, you can see the US and the UK stood together, while USSR might stand in some other places when negotiations came on to the three. What I mean is that actually the Big Three was not as solidary as we have expected, especially when an immediate threat was gone. So we can tell that actually among the Big Three, there wasn't some long-term interest that can bind them together. So the first lesson from the Yalta Conference in 1945 is actually, even though there is alliance, there's a limit. For example, Donald Trump, now president, and he and his administration actually has had a lot of quarrels with his like-minded partners and allies.
Yes.
So alliance, yes, they work better to safeguard our security, but they are not the long-term solution for the perpetual peace or for a more stable political environment. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson, if I want to mention, is the unintended consequences of territorial agreements. After the Yalta Conference, actually the Eastern Europe was divided, and actually a lot of the piece of land fell into the hands of USSR.
Yeah.
And these territorial agreements led to a lot of displaced people, either within their own domestic boundaries or they fled away from domestic to some foreign countries. For example, the Germans, Polish and Ukrainians. And not only we saw a lot of forced immigrations or refugees, you can say that, but we also see these movements of these displaced people cause some ethnic conflicts after the World War II. The Yalta Conference resulted in some political ambiguity that helped rebuild some political interactions among the big three. However, this political ambiguity may solve the tension temporarily, but it may not be able to serve as a panacea for the perpetual peace.
And Peifen, what do you think is the most important takeaway for Taiwan? And how can Ukraine work with other European allies to ensure Ukraine's interests are protected?
So we all remember the confrontation between Zelenskyy and Trump in White House. So when Zelenskyy walked into the White House, I think that he thought he's still the beacon of democracy and everything the USA and Western countries have been upholding. But the thing is, he didn't realize that the role of the US had moved from an ally, a partner of Ukraine, to a mediator, and a very, as I mentioned, impatient mediator. So Zelenskyy didn't realize that he's no longer seen as a hero in many eyes. So the world is changing very rapidly. And the second lesson for me is that you have to be more realistic and pragmatic than idealistic when dealing with international relations. So to be very honest, the international relations has always been realistic, but it's even more so now than before. So this idea of democracy and democratic camp is valuable and worth upholding at all times. But we have to be very careful because we can put all of the eggs in just one single basket and think that this idea itself can protect us from any dangers.
Thank you, Peifen and Professor Huang, for your great insights. Thank you for watching our shows today. Stay safe and see you next time.